Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Tuesday, 15 October 2024. It is the 180th anniversary of the birth of Friedrich Nietzsche, who was born in Röcken in Saxony, then part of Prussia, on this date in 1844. Nietzsche himself wrote of his birthday, quote, "As I was born on the 15th of October, the birthday of the king above mentioned, I naturally received the Hohenzollern names of Friedrich Wilhelm. There was in any case one advantage in the choice of this day. My birthday throughout the whole of my childhood was a day of public rejoicing." Unquote. That's from Exe Homo. It's easy to imagine how this would make an impression on a child, but Nietzsche's later life wasn't as celebrated or as celebratory, though his posthumous reputation has been all out of proportion to the Hohenzollerns, who are now forgotten while Nietzsche enjoys posthumous fame. Nietzsche may be the most influential philosopher of the past 200 years. His influence has far exceeded the philosophers who claim them as their own, but his wider audience has not weakened his influence within philosophy itself. I have a collection of papers titled The Ethics of History, the introduction of which says of the contributions to the volume, quote, "The most commonly cited philosopher is Nietzsche, a sign that the post-structuralist canon of his opinion is respected even by its critics," unquote. This is the bizarre juxtaposition of Nietzsche and post-structuralism. And I don't think Nietzsche would have spared a glance for, or spared a word for, or a glance at post-structuralism. But this is how he and his thought are tamed in contemporary academic thought. The contributors to this volume, the Ethics of History volume I just mentioned, are among the most renowned philosophers of history, and it includes several individuals on whom I have recorded episodes. David Carr, who is one of the editors of the volume, Arthur Danto, and Frank Ankersmit. I don't think Nietzsche would have recognized himself in the work of any of these scholars, but that is an argument for another time. I've mentioned Nietzsche in many episodes already. Nietzsche, for example, was a correspondent of Jakob Burckhardt after having first been his student. So I quoted a letter Nietzsche wrote to Burckhardt in my episode on Burckhardt. But mostly I have referenced Nietzsche's tripartite distinction among monumental, antiquarian, and critical history. Whatever you may think of this distinction from a theoretical point of view, it's convenient since it gives us a framework within which we can recognize many, if not most, historical efforts. The distinction among monumental, antiquarian, and critical history appears in an 1874 essay that has been translated as "The Use and Abuse of History," or as "The Advantages and Disadvantages of History for Life." This essay, along with three other early essays, is collected in a volume that has been variously translated as "Thoughts Out of Season," "Untimely Meditations," and "Unseasonable Observations." Nietzsche himself called the untimely meditations "four attempts at assassination." In my episode on David Strauss, I mentioned Nietzsche's untimely meditation on Strauss, which was an attack on his work, but it was not the attack that most at the time were making on Strauss. Most of the attacks on Strauss were the result of Strauss having applied the methods of critical history to biblical texts. Nietzsche attacked Strauss because he saw Strauss as a manifestation of a sick culture. Many years later, in Exe Homo, Behold the Man, Nietzsche would write of his hit piece on Strauss, quote, "I attacked David Strauss, more precisely, the success of a senile book with the cultured people in Germany. I caught this culture in the act," unquote. Many of Nietzsche's hit pieces were like this, intemperate and spectacular and intentionally provocative. He expected his targets and their allies to clap back at him, and they did. But the untimely meditation on history wasn't an attack on a person, it was an attack on an idea. It was an attack on history as a form of knowledge and as a mode of understanding. And to appreciate what was going on, you need to understand how history had been increasing in prestige as a discipline, especially since Röcken put the discipline on a sound footing. This was true across the continent of Europe, but it was especially true in Germany. In previous episodes, I mentioned Georg Igger's book, The German Conception of History, which provides the background to understand the rise of the influence of history as a discipline and even as a cultural phenomenon. Despite the efforts of Röcken and those who followed Röcken, I never tire of pointing out that history is not a science. Nietzsche saw this, and he believed that the convergence of history on being truly scientific would be a disaster. On that, he wrote, quote, "History become pure sovereign science would be for mankind a sort of conclusion of life and a settling of accounts with it," unquote. Much of the thesis of the use and abuse of history is summarized at the end of the first section. Quote, "Insofar as it stands in the service of life, history stands in the service of an unhistorical power, and thus subordinate, it can and should never become a pure science, such as, for instance, mathematics is," unquote. Immediately after this, Nietzsche makes his distinction among monumental, antiquarian, and critical history. Of monumental history, Nietzsche says, quote, "History belongs above all to the men of deeds and power, to him who fights a great fight, who needs models, teachers, comforters, and cannot find them among his contemporaries," unquote. And, quote, "That the great moments in the struggle of the human individual constitute a chain, that this chain unites mankind across the millennia like a range of human mountain peaks, and that the summit of each of such a long ago moment shall be for me still living, bright and great. This is the fundamental idea of the faith in humanity, which finds expression in the demand for monumental history," unquote. Monumental history is familiar to us in all the accounts of the past in which great men did great things. This is the sense in which Herodotus begins his history, as I mentioned in yesterday's episode on Hannah Arendt. Much of this traditional history is thus monumental history. Next, Nietzsche takes account of antiquarian history, and each of his sections on each of these kinds of history is about 2 or 3 pages long, so it's very detailed. Quote, "History thus belongs in the second place to him who preserves and reveres, to him who looks back to whence he has come, to where he came into being, with love and loyalty. And with this piety, he is, as it were, give thanks for his existence by tending with care that which has existed, by tending with care that which has existed from old, he wants to preserve for those who shall come into existence after him the conditions under which he himself came into existence, and thus he serves life," unquote. Antiquarian history may be the least familiar form of history to us today, but it still exists, flourishing in what we could call the interstices of our culture, though not in the spotlight. Antiquarian history inhabits the pages of thousands of pamphlets and booklets written by local historians about local sites of interest. Whenever I travel, I visit a castle or a palace or a house of some past figure. I always buy the booklet that's on sale at the ticket counter to give myself a little background on what I'm seeing. So I've got quite a collection of these booklets, and often you find details in these booklets that you won't find anywhere else. So I go back to my hotel room when I'm traveling and I read these pamphlets on local history and soak in the feeling of antiquarian history that's embodied with them, because they are filled with the spirit of love and affection felt by those who have a personal connection to the heritage they understand to be in their care only for a time, to be passed down to coming generations. Finally, Nietzsche on critical history. Quote, "If he is to live, man must possess from time to time the strength to break up and dissolve a part of the past. He does this by bringing it before the tribunal, scrupulously examining it, and finally condemning it. Every past, however, is worthy to be condemned, for that is the nature of human beings. Human violence and weakness have always played a mighty role in them. It is not justice which here sits in judgment. It is even less mercy which pronounces the verdict. It is life alone, that dark driving power that insatiably thirsts for itself. Its sentence is always unmerciful, always unjust, because it has never proceeded out of a pure well of knowledge. But in most cases, the sentence would be the same, even if it were pronounced by justice itself." Unquote. Most history of science was formerly monumental history, but there has been a reaction against this, a significant reaction against this, which I mentioned in my episode on Thomas Kuhn. Now, histories and historians are focused on tearing down great figures, bringing them before the bar of history in order to condemn them and to oversee their replacement by other accounts that are equally free both of monumental greatness and antiquarian affection. Thus, history of science today is overwhelmingly critical history, but not only the history of science. The critical spirit today has entered into a stage of hypertrophy that cannot allow any monument to stand. So history on the whole is today perennially and primarily critical history, and it will remain so until the pendulum swings and a new age begins with a new perspective on history. Nietzsche himself might be identified as one of the central figures in the rise of critical history, as he enjoyed eviscerating his opponents as much as anyone. And this often came at the expense of the kind of historical pieties celebrated by the antiquarian historian. We could even say of Nietzsche's The Use and Abuse of History that it is a critical history of historiography, and as such, it brings the history of history to the bar and condemns it, as Nietzsche in his other untimely meditations condemned David Strauss, Schopenhauer, and Richard Wagner. The last of the four untimely meditations is Richard Wagner and Bayreuth. Nietzsche had been a close friend of the Wagners for many years, and he had been an early believer in Wagner before Wagner's triumphs. In fact, Nietzsche left at Wagner's very moment of triumph at the first Wagner festival at Bayreuth was about to begin. There's a beautiful passage from his essay, Richard Wagner and Bayreuth, in which Nietzsche recollects their earlier time together before their break. Quote, "When on that day in the May of 1872, the foundation stone was laid on the hill at Bayreuth amid pouring rain and under a darkened sky, Wagner drove with some of us back to the town. He was silent, and he seemed to be gazing into himself with a look not to be described in words. It was the first day of his 60th year. Everything that had gone before was a preparation for this moment. We know that at times of exceptional danger, or in general at any decisive turning point of their lives, men compress together all they have experienced in an infinitely accelerated inner panorama and behold distant events as sharply as their most recent ones. What may Alexander the Great not have seen in the moment he caused Asia and Europe to be drunk out of the same cup? What Wagner beheld within him on that day, however, how he became what he is and what he will be, we who are closest to him can, to a certain extent, also see. It is only from this Wagnerian inner view that we shall be able to understand his great deed itself, and with this, his understanding guarantee its fruitfulness." Unquote. Nietzsche was among those few who were present when the foundation stone was laid at Bayreuth. But when Wagner was approaching his greatest fame, Nietzsche chose self-imposed exile from Wagner and his circle. Even here, when he's attacking Wagner in this untimely meditation, we can feel Nietzsche's spiritual intimacy with Wagner, with whom he had already broken when he wrote this. There's a story that years after Nietzsche went insane, someone showed him a picture of Wagner, then long dead, and Nietzsche said, "Him I loved much." It was inevitable that Nietzsche and Wagner would come into conflict. Both of them were myth makers. Probably more importantly, they lived by different myths. There's no more fundamental way to be at variance with another person than to have a different mythology than them. And Nietzsche and Wagner were fundamentally different in this way, despite their many years of friendship before their break. Nietzsche would go on to write against Wagner many times. In addition to the untimely meditation against Wagner, he wrote a book against Wagner, The Case of Wagner. And in the third essay on the genealogy of morals, begins with an attack on Wagner. And Nietzsche's last work, a short collection of aphorisms revised and collected from earlier works, was Nietzsche contra Wagner. So what was it that Wagner represented that Nietzsche thought merited this kind of response? Wagner wrote enormous operas, an enormous score for an enormous orchestra intended for an enormous audience. Kenneth Clark quoted Samuel Johnson that opera is, quote, an extravagant and irrational entertainment, and said, quote, opera, next to Gothic architecture, is one of the strangest inventions of Western man. It could have not been seen by any logical process, unquote. Clark argued that it was the very irrational of opera that was its appeal, but I don't think that irrationality captures what's going on. Despite his feeling for art, Clark had almost nothing to say about mythology in his history of Western civilization. But if he had had more of a sense of the role of mythology, he might have said that opera was a vehicle for mythology in the 19th century in the way that film was a vehicle for mythology in the 20th century. Wagner didn't call his works operas, he called them music dramas or Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art intended to convey its message equally through words, music, and theatrical spectacle. And all of this would go on for hours on end, as Nietzsche would eventually make fun of. Today, we might call this synesthesia, as it was intended to involve all the senses and thus to draw the viewer into the performance as a kind of vicarious participant. Today, with our multi-hour films and immersive video games, this doesn't surprise us, but it was unprecedented in the 19th century when Wagner embarked on his great works. Wagner's conception of what a work of art ought to be, and this was significantly influenced by Schopenhauer, who had also significantly influenced Nietzsche, was so out of proportion to the facilities available at the time that he had his own opera house constructed for the sole purpose of performing his works, which is the Festival House in Bayreuth, which still exists and still has its annual Wagner Festival. There's a 9-hour film about Wagner from 1983, starring Richard Burton, that provides the context for this work, and I recommend seeing the film. Wagner's final work was the opera Parsifal. Although they had been long out of contact, Wagner sent the score of Parsifal to Nietzsche. Nietzsche hated it. Parsifal was the spectacle of the world saved by a fool. In his On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche wrote, quote, was this Parsifal meant seriously? For one might be tempted to suppose the reverse, might even desire it, that the Wagnerian Parsifal was intended as a joke, as a kind of epilogue and satyr play with which the tragedian Wagner wanted to take leave of us, also of himself, above all of tragedy, in a fitting manner worthy of himself, namely with an extravagance of wanton parody of the tragic itself, of the whole gruesome earthly seriousness and misery of his previous works, of the crudest form, overcome at long last of the anti-nature of the ascetic ideal, unquote. Nietzsche's mythology was worlds apart from Wagner and the Ring Cycle and Parsifal. Nietzsche didn't take his mythological models either from the Germanic or the Arthurian traditions, as Wagner did. Nietzsche's "Thus Spake Zarathustra" was written in a biblical style, or what we might call a prophetic voice. But the prophet is Zarathustra, very roughly based on the ancient Persian prophet Zoroaster. Nietzsche's Zarathustra doesn't really owe anything to Zoroaster but the name, and the fact that Nietzsche wanted to drive home the point that this was no Siegfried and no Parzival. The figure of Zarathustra is for Nietzsche like the figure of Socrates is for Plato, a mouthpiece for his own views. The prophet Zarathustra is on a mission. We might even say he's on a historical mission, and this was to celebrate the eternal yes to life. Nietzsche's criticism of history and Parzival, both as they were, was that both of them were anti-nature, anti-life, and were embodiments of an ascetic ideal that says no to life, and so represents the antithesis of what Nietzsche wanted to convey. Nietzsche's mythology is also expressed in what he called the eternal recurrence. Nietzsche's claims about the eternal recurrence are presented as though they were metaphysical claims about time, but I think he asserted them only because of their moral consequences. As with Kant, ethics is central to Nietzsche's thought, if not more so than in Kant. Kant took his metaphysics seriously. For Nietzsche, metaphysics was a rhetorical strategy. I don't want to be dismissive of rhetorical strategies because they give us an imaginative picture of the world that often informs the entirety of our thought. And this is what Nietzsche was after. That is to say, the imaginative picture communicated in rhetoric is the mythology. So for Nietzsche, if I'm interpreting him correctly, time itself is cyclical, and in its cyclicality, it drags human history around with it, making history cyclical as well. But since the metaphysics of the eternal return is, as I have argued, a mythological device, time and history are cyclical primarily in a moral sense. It's the moral lesson that is central. And I think that's best communicated by Nietzsche in a very well-known section 341 from The Gay Science. Quote, "How, if some day or night a demon were to sneak after you in your loneliest loneliness and say to you, 'This life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more, and there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything immeasurably small or great in your life must return to you, all in the same succession and sequence, even as this spider and this moonlight between the trees, and even this moment and I myself. The eternal hourglass of existence is turned over and over, and you with it, a grain of the dust. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or did you once experience a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, 'You are a god, and I have never heard anything more godly,'" unquote. This is about driving home the point of saying yes to life. Nietzsche even rounds out his mythology with an eschatology, which is his depressing vision of the last man. Nietzsche has Zarathustra introduced the last man and thus spoke Zarathustra in this way. Quote, "Lo, I show you the last man. What is love? What is creation? What is longing? What is a star? So asketh the last man and blinketh. The earth hath then become small, and on it there hoppeth the last man who maketh everything small. His species is ineradicable like that of the ground flea. The last man liveth longest. We have discovered happiness, say the last men, and blink thereby. They have left the regions where it was hard to live, for they need warmth. One still loveth one's neighbor and rubbeth up against him, for one needeth warmth. Turning ill and being distrustful, they consider sinful. They walk warily. He is a fool who still stumbleth over stones or men. A little poison now and then, that maketh pleasant dreams, and much poison at last for a pleasant death. One still worketh, for work is pastime, but one is careful lest the pastime should hurt one. One could longer One no longer becometh rich or poor. Both are too burdensome. Who still wanteth to rule? Who still wanteth to obey? Both are too burdensome. No shepherd and one herd. Everyone wanteth the same. Everyone is equal. He who hath other sentiments goeth voluntarily into the madhouse. Formerly all the world was insane, say the subtlest of them, and blink thereby. They are clever and know all that hath happened, so there is no end to their raillery. People still fall out, but are soon reconciled. Otherwise it spoileth their stomachs. They have little pleasures for the day, and their little pleasures for the night, but they have a record for health. We have discovered happiness, say the last men, and blink thereby. Unquote. Whether or not this is a philosophy of history, it certainly is a vision of history. What Nietzsche wrote in his untimely meditation, The Use and Abuse of History, could be said to constitute what I have called in earlier episodes a non-philosophy of history, or even an anti-philosophy of history. But Nietzsche was rarely a systematic philosophical thinker, which is why he may be so congenial to and influential in our own time, since he left us a large body of work, but no system. As with many of the figures I have discussed, if we want to find a philosophy of history in Nietzsche, we have to reconstruct it from the fragments Nietzsche left. And whether or not Nietzsche had a philosophy of history is a distinct question from whether Nietzsche is useful for us in the construction of our own philosophy of history. And here I think it's obvious that we have to take account of Nietzsche. History hasn't been the same since Nietzsche took the discipline out behind the woodshed in his untimely meditation on history. With Nietzsche, as with all non-philosophies of history and anti-philosophies of history, if we want to make the case for history and historical understanding, we need to take the bull by the horns and face these critiques square on. So happy birthday, Friedrich Nietzsche. Let me know what I missed or what I've gotten wrong in the comments, and thanks for listening.